Good afternoon. As I said, good morning, good evening, wherever you are, you're welcome. We're so happy to have you here. I'm Janice Kaminer-Resnick, and on behalf of Jews United for Democracy and Justice and Community Advocates, Inc., we welcome you to our America at a Crossroads program. We thank tonight's esteemed guests, Ron Brownstein and Bill Kristol. We look forward to their analysis as we enter what will surely be a frantic and intense political year. Tomorrow night, Thursday, we are presenting a special program to help those who are interested better understand the judicial reform crisis in Israel. Yesterday, for the first time in the history of Israel, all 15 Supreme Court justices there sat to hear a case. It was probably also unprecedented that the argument lasted for 13 hours. The case relates to the judicial reform legislation passed by the Israeli parliament, which limits the power of the court. Many have said that the very foundation of Israel's democracy is at stake and might be crumbling. Tomorrow, acclaimed American-born Israeli and New York Times best-selling author and journalist Yossi Klein Halevi will be in conversation with one of America's great rabbis, Rabbi Ed Feinstein, to discuss the overall crisis of democracy in Israel. The topic, Israel's divided soul, is Israeli democracy at the breaking point? Excuse me. Next week on September 20, we will dedicate the entire program to talking about the changing demographics of the American electorate, in particular about America's youngest voters. Our speakers will be three experts on the topic: documentary filmmaker Mac Heller, Democratic pollster Celinda Lake, and millennial expert Morley Winograd. The following week, on September 27th, we'll hear from the brilliant publisher of The Bulwark, Sarah Longwell. Sarah is a GOP political strategist and the founder of Republican Voters Against Trump. In her own words, she has dedicated her career to fighting Trump's takeover of her party. Two additional important points. First, for those who celebrate, we wish you a meaningful and joyful Rosh Hashanah, Happy Jewish New Year. And second, we are very grateful for your donations, which enable us to produce these programs. We have no paid staff. We are all volunteers and promise that the funds you donate are used carefully and wisely. All donations are tax deductible, and you can find the link in the chat tonight or in any email you receive from us. Somewhere in there is a donation link. Now for a few more highlights on upcoming events, my colleague David Lair. David?
Thank you, Janice. Welcome all to America at a Crossroads on behalf of Community Advocates. And thank you for joining us once again as we approach our 180th weekly broadcast. And a special thanks to those of you who responded so generously to our request for support over the past weekend. It's been quite an overwhelming and very positive response. Just a reminder, if you can't make our live Wednesday evening programs, they are archived on youtube.com on the Jews United for Democracy and Justice channel. Just scroll through the programs there and watch the ones you missed. It turns out that over 43,000 hours of viewing of our programs have taken place on YouTube after our initial live broadcast. That's a lot of hours. On October 4th, we will again host Greg Bluestein, the Atlanta Journal-Constitution reporter who is an award-winning political journalist and a regular MSNBC and NBC contributor. He authored the 2022 book, Flipped: How Georgia Turned Purple and Broke the Monopoly on Republican Power. He's been dubbed Georgia's chief political reporter. He will update us on District Attorney Fani Willis's prosecution, where it is headed and when. The following week, we have a very special guest, the only female speaker in the history of the United States House of Representatives, Speaker Emerita Nancy Pelosi. That'll be October 11th. She'll be in dialogue with LA Times Pulitzer Prize reading columnist Pat Morrison, discussing America's challenges. Tonight's discussion will be led by Bill Kristol, a man who's been described as the intellectual Brahmin of the modern conservative movement. He's been a regular commentator on ABC's This Week, a columnist for the New York Times, as well as a presence on CNN and MSNBC, and the editor-at-large of the leading Never Trump online journal, The Bulwark. For those of you who enjoy our programs, his video and audio podcast, Conversations with Bill Kristol, are must viewing. We're lucky to have Bill back. Bill?
Thanks, Janice, David. Great to be back with you two and all of you there, and with my friend Ron Brownstein. We've done this a few times before, I think, and we've also been on conversations with Bill Kristol a few times, and they've been good conversations. So I hope we can keep that standard here. Ron needs very little introduction, really one of our leading political commentators, analysts, thinkers, author of several books on American politics. You can read him in The Atlantic and at CNN.com. You can watch him on CNN. His most recent book, Rock the Water, on the 1974 mixture of politics, music, movies, and missing something at TV, I guess, in LA. So that's almost 50 years ago, huh? Is out in paperback, so you can get it don't have to pay that exorbitant hardcover cost. So that's good, and you should get that book too. But Ron, it's great to be with you. And
great to be with you, Bill. I think we met. I'm pretty sure we met in 1986 when you were the chief of staff for Bill Bennett at the Education Department, and I was writing a story about how for the National Journal about how the Reagan administration was credentialing young conservatives. And I think two of the people that I met and I stayed in touch with the longest from that were you and Pete Weiner, both of whom have gone on to become significant voices in the kind of honorable resistance in the conservative ranks to what Trumpism has done to the party. So looking forward to continuing this 40-year conversation.
Yeah, was that for the were you with the LA Times?
That was the National Journal. That was the National Journal then. Yeah, that was before I lived in LA and worked for the LA Times.
Or you sold out to the West Coast,
Yeah. Yes.
Some of us toughing it out back here, but that's okay. Don't feel bad for us,
I'm looking at palm trees out my window, like many of the
I know he always torments me whenever I talk to him on the phone. I'm like, sweating. I've walked around Washington in 95-degree weather, or I'm in my air-conditioned office, and
it's 17 in the winter. Yeah, either one.
It's a tough life you guys have. Okay.
All right, here we are.
So let's. I think the title we gave this show is something like the reality of today's politics. So let's be hard-headed, realistic, and it's not all happy, but it's challenging, but important, right? So where are we? It's September, 13th, after Labor Day, 14 months before the election. Let's just quickly go through the scene. Republicans, Donald Trump, there he is, right? January 6th, 2021 happened. 4 indictments have happened. How dominant is he? Is there any real chance that he'll be derailed as the Republican nominee?
There's always a chance, but in practice, I mean, if the question is in theory, could Donald Trump be denied the nomination? The answer would have to be yes. If the question is in practice, is this group of candidates showing any of the skill and chutzpah to actually beat him? I think you would have to say no. I mean, especially watching that first debate. There is a tradition in Iowa. The last 3 contested Republican primaries, the Iowa caucus has voted against the front runner. And I came away from Iowa and the state fair last month, like every other political reporter in America. I came away thinking that it was possible for someone to squeeze past Trump the way Santorum edged out Romney and Cruz edged out Trump in 16, largely because the much of the political infrastructure of the state, including the very powerful evangelical Christian networks, really don't want Trump. They want somebody else, but they've all pretty much put their eggs in the basket of Ron DeSantis before they got to see how he could relate or not to voters. And so, on paper, I could imagine DeSantis doing what Cruz did or Santorum did or Huckabee did, and mobilizing evangelicals in Iowa to beat the front runner. In practice, it's hard to imagine. And even if he does, each of those last 3 Iowa winners, as you know, who beat the front runner, didn't win the nomination. None of them won more than a dozen states. And it's hard to look at this field and say right now they have what it takes, to borrow from Richard Ben Kramer, to beat Trump.
It is amazing. Trump is sort of the incumbent, basically, the most Republican president, the only ex-president to losers to then run again. So we could have 2 presidents running against each other in 6 months, which we haven't had since the late 19th century, I guess, right?
Cleveland and Harrison, yeah.
Yeah, but I think a lot of us underestimate. I mean, I was always thought Trump likely to be the nominee, and I think it's more likely now. I think I underestimated. Still, kind of the way we all wrote about it. It was, well, there's a Republican field. And there's a front runner, and then there's a second candidate, DeSantis, who's coming up, and there are these people. We're used to doing that. And I think it probably would have been more accurate to say, basically, there's an incumbent, and then there's a bunch of challengers. Will any of them get sort of takeoff speed to really be a serious challenger? Could happen. Obviously, incumbents get seriously challenged, but sometimes. And it's his party, and there's, I don't know.
I don't know. Given for all those reasons that you cite, I mean, it really would have required a louder chorus of voices that Republican voters trust to tell them that this was the wrong thing to do. And that has just never coalesced. I mean, certainly around the indictments, the most that people who are skeptical of Trump will do is remain silent. I mean, that's as far as Mitch McConnell will go, to not echo Elise Stefanik saying, this is demonic. I think there's a Calvin Trillin poem in there somewhere. Elise Stefanik thinks indictment is demonic. But that hasn't happened. And at each
even Trump's own opponents have
Yeah.
criticized the indictments. But I think you're so right. I mean, one doesn't know if DeSantis has been a stronger candidate, could have been different maybe. And I do think if the Republican elected office holders had really united, said this is just unacceptable. He cannot be nominee, and we can't maybe even go as far as to say they couldn't vote for him in the general. But there's been none of that. There's scattered people saying on one Sunday show, I'm really kind of disturbed by the idea. A couple say they won't vote for him. But did we have a letter from 15 Republican governors saying, this, we respect him, we think he did some good things as president, he cannot be the nominee? Nothing like that. I mean, the establishment is discredited or weak, but it's partly discredited or weak because it doesn't step up and try to use its authority, right?
Absolutely. That's absolutely right. And so, so you're in a situation where the only voices that Republicans are hearing that they trust are saying that you have to be with Trump because the deep state and the left is trying to destroy him. I mean, John Thune and Mitch McConnell and John Cornyn may not agree with that, but the most they will do is not say it. They won't actively contest it. And as you say, the other candidates won't even really contest it other than Christie and Hutchison and Will Hurd, and in some vague ways, Nikki Haley, although not really. I mean, just think about the period since the debate. I mean, the candidates did not use his absence to make a case against him. I mean, and in the period since, they've almost vanished. I mean, the Republican race doesn't seem to be happening, at this point. And so the weeks go by, and Donald Trump is polling nationally at 55 or 60. And yes, he is in a more exposed position in Iowa and New Hampshire, not surprisingly, since those voters are seeing television ads and an actual campaign. But there simply is no sign that anyone is consolidating the voters who are most resistant to Trump, much less peeling off some of his support. And the one who was positioned to do that, DeSantis, a year ago, unquestionably is much weaker in every possible way than he was the day after the election, which, by the way, was another juncture. I mean, you look at it, it was January 6th, impeachment, the day after the election, the indictments, 4 times when what you were describing could have had a big impact if a large coalesced group of Republicans had come together and say, we cannot go down this road. We cannot go any further down this road. But each time they didn't, they're kind of like hoping that a meteor would strike the earth and somehow dislodge Trump's support. Or maybe they're just fatalistic. I think we talked about this last time we did did one of these sessions, but I still go back to that anonymous consultant who said in Politico, maybe we all just have to go into the basement, into the storm cellar, and lock the door and let the tornado blow through, because we just can't summon the will to try to stop it.
We'll get on from Trump here in 30 seconds, but the other thing is it's a little hard to see over the next 3-4 months until Iowa. I mean, stipulating that Iowa and New Hampshire could be a little different. They're small states with huge focus, and voters like sort of making up their mind and not being part of the national herd and so forth.
Iowa especially, yeah.
But what's going to happen? I mean, I feel like there could be, of course, unexpected surprises, unknowns, but basically he's, I think, very revealing. At the debate, he wasn't really attacked for not being there. Nikki Haley hasn't capitalized on a pretty good showing at the debate, apparently, and maybe 1 or 2 points up, but nothing big, right? No, like, I'm all in, I'm spending, every cent I have in Iowa, I'm going to beat him. It can't be Trump. None of that kind of stuff. More normal campaigning as if it's competitive, and Trump's 40 points ahead. And what's going to happen over the next 2 months? It feels to me like, each week goes after, there's nothing. I mean, there are no new indictments, I think. There's no trial beginning. There's no, presumably, there'll be a government shutdown. That'll be a mess. Trump will say something, but it's not going to be decisive for the presidential race, presumably. So that's where I do think the chances of a sort of disruption seem diminishing.
Yeah, well, I felt like the big question of the first debate was whether they could force him onto the stage for future debates by making him regret not being there, by using his absence to, use the hour and a half to make a case that he's not there to rebut. They didn't do that.
Very
There's
good point. No, that's such a good point. People don't
there's
come.
no reason for him to show up at the next debate. It didn't, the debate was I described it in the Atlantic as the Rosencrantz and Guildenstern debate,
Right.
characters on the periphery of the action whose existence was rendered meaningless by the absence of the central protagonist. And, their failure to use the time to put any pressure on Trump means that is he going to show up at this Reagan library debate for Fox in September? Not likely. Maybe he'll show up at I think he does have to show up on the debates in the early states, because skipping those can look like you're dissing not only the sponsors, but the voters in those states. But yeah, again, none of these candidates have shown they have anything of what it takes to fundamentally change the dynamic. That doesn't mean that probably DeSantis, as the most likely candidate, can't burrow into Iowa, get the endorsement of Bob Vander Plaats and the others in a few weeks, and and just kind of by dint of kind of beavering his way through the state, beat Trump by a point in Iowa. I suppose that could happen, although it seems less likely to me than it did a month ago. But again, even if you do that, there's just no sense that they're building a national campaign that would allow them to go any further than Huckabee, Santorum, or Cruz did by following exactly that strategy.
Yeah, and just to really close out with Trump. I mean, the other thing that could have made a difference, I think, is if 6 months ago there had been national polls showing Trump losing by 8 points to Biden and the others winning by 2 or 3. There's a little bit of that with Haley recently, but really nothing. I mean, Trump is now even with Biden in about 4,
as we'll talk about,
proposed, which has helped Trump hugely, I think. It's sort of like, again, the dog that didn't bark. It meant they couldn't really claim with credibility that Trump has no chance to win, which he does have a chance to win. And therefore, that argument went away. So unless they were willing to confront the fact that he shouldn't be president, the argument that sounds very tinny, that, well, he doesn't have a chance to win,
So the 3D chess would be that Biden's weakness now is actually helping him in the long run, because it makes it more likely that he will get Trump as the opponent, and Trump is still the candidate he may be most likely to beat.
Yeah,
That's not crazy.
Meanwhile, we've got this national race with Trump after everything, January 6th, 2 impeachments, 4 indictments, even with the incumbent president of the United States, who's done objectively, I would say, a pretty good job. But let's leave, whatever people think about that, they can make their own mind up. He's running ahead really a little bit, Trump, of where he was in 2020, in the sense that he lost by 4.5 points, and these polls are more like even 1 point, 2 point. So you can argue that the polls maybe about this. So, well, like you argue, the scenario for Biden Biden's a little stronger ultimately, and so, but it is a little shocking, isn't it? I mean, I'm personally just sort of amazed that we're not in a recession, he's handled Ukraine pretty well. He's on the right side of some big debates like abortion and other issues that have broken in the last year or two. And despite that, he being Biden in the sense, despite that, Trump is even with Biden. So
yeah. I'm guessing a lot of people who are listening to us tonight are here precisely to kind of understand that question, and maybe to find a reason to inch back 4 inches from the ledge outside of their second story window. Look, I think there are a couple reasons why this is happening. They're significant. It doesn't mean that Biden can't win in the end, or that I would not favor him right now even to win in the end. But it does tell us a few things. I mean, the first thing it tells us is that and this is, I'll look over my shoulder at the book, The Bitter End, An Identity Crisis by John Sides and Lynn Vavreck and their colleagues. We are in an extraordinarily dug-in moment in our politics. And they use the phrase calcification of our politics. There are simply not a lot of voters who are available to switch sides for whatever reason, whatever is going on. In many ways, the critical variable is not moving the small number of independent voters or gettable voters, although that's important. It's how many of each side you can mobilize to come out. It's worth noting that 40 states have voted the same way in at least the past 4 consecutive presidential elections, which is a higher percentage than even in the 4 consecutive that Roosevelt won, from 32 to 46. It's the highest 4-election unanimity or uniformity that we've had since at least the turn of the 20th century. So we are really really dug in. But look, I think it does tell you that there is substantial resistance in the electorate to reelecting Biden. I mean, there's just no other way to look at it. I mean, I think there were Democrats, many Democrats were hoping that when the economy got a little better, that resistance would, begin to abate. But we're not really seeing it. And the Democratic strategists that I talked to, I know you talked to many of them too, are both surprised, frustrated, and a little unnerved by how steady and persistent this resistance is. I wrote a piece recently, as you know, basically arguing that if you look at the four biggest things that have changed since 2020, in my view, two of them are strengthening Trump, hurting Biden, and two of them are strengthening Biden and hurting Trump. Inflation is a huge factor here. It is completely eclipsing all of the other good news in the economy. When you ask people how they are judging, there's a recent poll, I think it was YouGov Economist, you ask people, how are they measuring the quality of the economy? Inflation dwarfs anything else. And, for upper middle class people, inflation is an inconvenience, a frustration. I know, as one pollster said to me, nobody likes paying higher prices. But for people at the median income and below, it is more than that. It is really an existential crisis. In the CNN poll just now, last week. Almost 65% of people without a college degree, which includes and a substantial majority of non-white people without a college degree, said Biden's economic policies had hurt rather than strengthened the economy. So inflation.
If I could tell that you mentioned to me from a focus group that you would.
Right. And multiple Democratic strategists are reporting various versions of this with young non-white voters, especially men, who will say something to the effect of, I hate everything about Trump. I know he's a racist, but I had more money in my pocket when he was president. And, that is real. I mean, people, talk to Jason Furman. I just talked to him the other day, who was the Council of Economic Advisors chair under Obama. For a typical worker, they are 2,000 below where they would be in annual disposable income from the trajectory that the economy was on before the pandemic. So it's not only Biden's fault, but he's there while it's happening. That's one headwind. The other headwind, of course, is his age. And you can't look past it. We now have multiple polls, I think 4 or 5 polls that have had virtually the exact same result of 3/4 of Americans, including a majority of Democrats, saying they think he's too old to do the job for another term, right? The other side of the ledger, though, Trump has 2 big headwinds that were not there in 2020 either yet. January 6th happened after Election Day in 2020, and the Supreme Court overturned the right to abortion after 2020. And both of those are real challenges for Trump or any other Republican. And we did have a little bit of a test case of this in 2020, more than a little. We had a test case of these contending forces in 2022, when polls showed us that up to 4/5 of Americans were describing the economy in negative terms, and a significant majority in the exit polls said they disapproved of Biden's performance. But a majority also said they wanted abortion to remain legal, and a majority, particularly of independents, said they viewed the Republican candidates as extreme. And the two sides fought to something of a draw. Republicans won the national House popular vote. They won the House, but Democrats did much better than expected, even in the House, and certainly in the swing states that will decide the presidency in 24. So I think when you add all of this up, it's not totally shocking. I mean, it is shocking in the sense you have a candidate facing 91 criminal indictments who is step for step with the incumbent president, but it's not inexplicable.
Yeah, and the Democrats did best in the swing states where they could, legitimately make the argument that their opponent was a genuine MAGA extremist who was committed to election overturning. And a little hard for Trump to walk away from that. So that might help a Democrats running against Trump, as opposed
I still think it's easier for Biden than Trump to get to 270 electoral college votes because of those results. And particularly because I think that after the governor races in 22, I think it is going to be really hard to convince a majority of voters in Michigan, Pennsylvania, and probably Wisconsin to take a chance on electing a Republican president who might ban abortion in their borders through a nationwide abortion ban. I kind of feel like that reluctance of voters in those states to vote for a Republican who would sign a national abortion ban, there's no question that every one of them would if they can get it through Congress. I think that is kind of the castle keep for Biden, the last line of defense. If Biden wins Michigan and Pennsylvania, and after 2022, it's not clear to me that those two are really two swing states. They both seem to pretty clearly lean Democratic at this point, especially Michigan. But if he does win Michigan and Pennsylvania and holds the other 20 states that have voted Democratic in each of the past 4 elections, even losing Nevada in my scenario. So he wins 19 of the 20 states that have voted Democratic in at least 4 straight, Michigan and Pennsylvania. Even if Republicans take Nevada, which I'm not sure they would, Biden would get reelected by winning any of Georgia, Arizona, or Wisconsin. Republicans would have to win all 3. And so on the ledge, backing off the ledge kind of segment of the conversation, I would say that Biden still has an easier path to 270 than Trump in particular, but really any Republican. But I would say no one should underestimate how much resistance there is in the electorate to reelecting him, even among some people who think he's done a good job.
Yeah, no, I did a conversation, recorded one today, which will be up by midday tomorrow with James Carville, who has done this a little before, but really elaborated on why he thinks Biden shouldn't run again, and why he could be a very successful one-term president, and really has been, and could go down in history as that. But being a successful president doesn't mean you're necessarily the right candidate for a particular time. And I very much identify with that, having served in the George H.W. Bush White House, who I think history will record was a pretty good president, and from 1989 to 1993, and who went, think about this, who went from 54% of the vote, as I recall, in 1988 to about 38%, because Clinton and Perot was in there.
I think
too.
only Taft and Hoover had a bigger decline.
Yeah. So was Bush that bad a president that 1/3 of his voters deserted him in 4 years? We won the Cold War in those 4 years. We had a little recession, but then we were coming out of it in 92. We passed various bipartisan pieces of legislation, dealt with the budget deficit, actually, which helped get Clinton balance the budget a few years later. When voters want change, when voters are unhappy about stuff, or when voters get something in their head, this is sort of Carville's point. This isn't, he was trying to say, this isn't Bill Kristol's judgment or James Carville's judgment. The voters just, they really think Biden is too old. That doesn't mean they couldn't come back and vote for him at the end. It doesn't mean Biden doesn't beat Trump, as you just said. But Carville's pretty strongly of the view that any of these Democratic governors, almost any actual plausible Democratic nominee, with a question mark maybe the vice president, beats Trump. And he's of the view, and this is a minority view, I'd say, though I share it among Democrats in Washington or elsewhere, that the risks of the primary are less than the risks of renominating Biden. But that's a minority view. And as long as Biden wants to be the nominee, he most likely is the nominee. So I don't know, you agree?
Yeah, no, I've spoken with James too on their podcast and, offline about it. And he strongly believes that Democrats are making a huge mistake nominating Biden, and that another candidate would do better. There are a couple of points that are relevant. One, you do have to weigh the risk. If Biden steps aside, put it this way, there are not many people who worry about Biden winning who are more confident about Kamala Harris winning. The same group of people is uneasy about both. But denying the nomination to the first Black woman vice president would not be a clean incision. It would be a very messy operation that would leave problems in the party. And I'm not sure if the candidates who James and most other people think would be better, primarily Gretchen Whitmer, maybe in governor of Michigan, or conceivably Newsom, would even want to. Newsom has said he would even want to go down that road. I do think, though, that as we said, voters are really reluctant to give Biden another term, and that expression, that sentiment is going to find expression. At the least, it means that Democrats are going to be facing a much more unnerving election period than they might with a candidate who was further ahead of Trump. And it will have big implications for the Republican Party, as well. I mean, I should ask this as a question to you, but I would say the only way Trumpism loosens its grip on the Republican Party is if it's fundamentally repudiated by the electorate in a way that makes clear to any kind of vertical Republican that this is an untenable path going forward. Well, in a Trump-Biden rematch, it may not produce that decisive an outcome, even if he loses. I mean, Trump could stay close enough that Republican, or even win. If he doesn't win, which I still think he would be the underdog, but even if he doesn't win, he could stay close enough that Republicans could easily win the Senate. They might even hold the House, although I think the winner of the White House will likely win the House. And in any circumstance, it's just hard to imagine a Biden-Trump rematch that produces an outcome decisive enough to push the Republican Party off of kind of the Trump direction. And that's a real price for the country. I mean, because, you see in things like the Wisconsin threat to impeach the state Supreme Court justice before she's heard a case, that this style of quasi-authoritarian or even not quasi-authoritarian politics is really taking root in the Republican Party. And it's leaving us in a situation that we've never exactly faced as a country, where the commitment to the basic rules of democracy of one of the parties is now in systemic question. The sooner that, if ever, that the party could turn off of that course, the better. But I'm not sure a 24 Biden-Trump rematch is going to be the occasion to precipitate that.
Yeah, I mean, certainly defeats, from this point of view, defeating Trump is better than if he wins. But I agree. I mean, this was the problem with 2020. You and I did a conversation, actually, this was a week after. I remember we came out to LA, didn't we? Maybe that was on Zoom. We were giving up in the pandemic and coming out a week or two after the election. And we thought, and we were, I think both, it's safe to say, happy that Biden beat Trump, but worried about the fact that Republicans had picked up House seats. It was unclear at that point who was going to hold the Senate, because that only got resolved on January 5th. It was even. And basically, it wasn't enough of a repudiation. I remember both of us sort of thinking to really decisively bury Trumpism, or perhaps create incentives for the Republican leadership and other Republicans to really say that was, okay, one term, that was enough. We're moving on, really decisively moving on. Then January 6th happened. It's like, okay, this is really, this now allows them to say it. Once they blew that, I mean, I think historians will look back at that failure to convict in the Senate, led by Mitch McConnell, and think that maybe there were subsequent moments too after 22, and of course the indictments now. Maybe there will be subsequent moments, but yeah, we could go through 24 with a similar situation. And I think, and this is a theme you've been stressing so much, what does the country look like even if Biden wins a pretty close race? What do governments, state legislatures, local judges, law enforcement officials in Idaho or in Texas or in rural parts of the country and Trumpy parts of the country, do they really, fine, let's even assume the election isn't contested quite the way 2020 was, and everyone says, okay, Biden probably won. Do they just obey the federal government? Do they think it's all fine? Biden's in charge. We've got to do what this district judge says, or what the Biden administrator says and stuff. I think you have the degree of secessionism, nullification, I'm not quite sure what the word is, that requires a really decisive defeat to be broken, I think. And that worries me also. I mean, it's so.
Well, look, we're facing various forms of unraveling, where the fundamental cohesion of the country is coming apart in ways that, we haven't seen, I believe, since either the period before or the Civil War or during Reconstruction. I mean, it's on the one hand, now where we are now is we have Red America, the phrase I've used, essentially trying to build a nation within a nation, where they have their own rules, where they are, the general trend in American life from the 60s until maybe around 2010 was to nationalize more rights. We nationalized the right to abortion, to contraception, to interracial marriage, Title IX, the Americans with Disability Act, the Civil Rights Act of 64, the Voting Rights Act of 65. We reduced the ability of states to impinge on rights and set their own rules. Clearly, we're going in the opposite direction now on a whole range of issues: abortion, voting rights, LGBTQ rights, book bans, classroom censorship, heightened penalties for public protest, all these ways in which the red states are, while simultaneously challenging Biden's attempt to exercise national power on the environment and immigration in particular, I think Biden wins. All of that continues, deepens, intensifies this idea that we don't want to be part of your America. I think if Trump wins, that goes up to a whole other level than we've
Yeah,
potentially
that happens on the other side. I mean,
on the other side,
they're just
because
going to roll over for everything Trump wants to do, right?
right. I mean, we don't, no one's paying a lot of attention to what Trump is saying, other than that, I am your martyr. They're coming after me to get you. But, in his campaign videos that he's released, like 50 of them, he's promising to send the National Guard into blue cities to control crime. He's promising the biggest door-to-door deportation drive in American history. He's promising to overtly use sic the Justice Department on his enemies. He's promising to remove liberal prosecutors who are being elected in some of these big cities. So he is promising a level of offense and intrusion into blue city. Oh, and not to mention national versions of many of the laws that I'm just talking about. A national ban on how teachers talk about race, and maybe a national "Don't Say Gay" bill. And as I said, every Republican president, I think, would sign a national abortion ban. So, like, if even a fraction of this goes forward, like does Pritzker and Newsom and Tim Walz and Gretchen Whitmer, I leave out Hochul because I know she's kind of hapless. Like, do they say, okay, fine, you won, send in the National Guard to take over, like, the policing in LA? I mean, I don't know exactly how it gets expressed, but I think the way the country looks and operates could be very different by the end of a second Trump term, and the degree to which it is functioning as one country, which is already, I think, eroding. But I think the country would take it to
you were early and consistent on this theme of the 1850s. My friend Bob Kagan, the historian, says maybe the 1920s also where the South semi-system from the nation in terms of Jim Crow and the Ku Klux Klan, and a real intensification in a way of the racial Reconstruction too, but after Reconstruction, and sort of it is worrisome. And
the Supreme Court, of course, in Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896 was the key that unlocked the door that allowed the South to basically create a nation within a nation. And as I wrote in the Atlantic last Sunday, I mean, once again, the Supreme Court is likely to be the venue that makes the critical decisions that will decide how far red states can go this time in building a nation within a nation. And, look, so far the Supreme Court, by and large, has stopped blue states from impinging on rights that conservatives prize, and not stopped red states from impinging on rights that liberals prioritize. So, that is the end of the line for all of these red state laws are being challenged in court currently. And the opponents, the critics, the ACLU, the Justice Department, abortion rights groups, they're winning, they're holding their own in the lower courts. But, at the end of the line of all of these cases are those 6 Republican appointed justices on the Supreme Court. And we'll have to see whether they are going to defend the idea that there is a common baseline of civil rights that should be available to everybody, regardless of your zip code, or whether they're going to allow us to drift back into that pre-60s world where we had remarkably different rights regimes depending on where you lived.
And, it's not just red states, it's obviously the gaps between blue cities and red states, or red areas of blue states, to be fair. I mean, the other way, there's huge now cultural differences and hostility and attempts, therefore, by the red states and Texas family to suppress the efforts of Houston or Austin to have their own laws and procedures, or even what they teach and so forth. Conservatives used to talk about local school boards. Now it's the state saying, here's what your curriculum is. And so it could be in reverse too, of course. I mean, a little bit. Wisconsin,
it's happening in California in reverse. It is. But like in Texas, the state has taken over the election system and the school system in Houston. Like what is it, the fourth largest county in the country? I mean, and system and passed a law systematically overriding local statutes. I mean, even amid climate change, with all of these 100-degree days in Texas, the state legislature barred the cities from requiring water breaks for construction workers. I mean, that's kind of where we are.
I mean, Wisconsin for me is very revealing, and we'll go to questions here in a minute from people. But there, which is not a deep red state, obviously, it's a swing state. The judge who
hard to say what's
referendum on abortion rights on old Wisconsin abortion law, which allowed, I think, almost no exceptions, and it came back into sort of play after Dobbs. The judge, who basically indicated she didn't agree with that and didn't agree with the huge gerrymander in the Wisconsin state legislature, won 56-44, some huge margin for a state like Wisconsin. And now the legislature is seriously thinking about impeaching her because she said she expressed opinions on some judicial issues while running for judicial office, no different from what conservative judges had
Right,
expressed.
as the you saw that the AP chronicled this. I mean, conservative justices who condemned, same-sex relationships or praised the NRA, and are sitting on the court now, and no one's talking about impeachment. And of course, not only do they want to impeach her, but they want to impeach her and then not hold a trial in the Senate. So, because if they removed her, then the governor could appoint a replacement. So they want to disable the Supreme Court and leave it in a 3-3 tie. I mean, as I was saying before, the contempt for democracy is seeping down through the party in a way that is going to be very hard. Look, it's going to be hard to reverse even if Trump is off the scene after 2024. But it's, there are real, these are challenges that we have not had to face, certainly outside of the South, in a very long time.
Yeah, and people, I'll just say for myself, the people ask me, Sarah Longwell, who you'll have on in a couple of weeks here, why were you never Trump? You didn't like his style. You didn't agree with him on free trade or on a bunch of issues, all which is true enough. It's vulgar. He's this, that. But this was the fundamental reason, right? They went, and I don't think many of us maybe didn't quite articulate it or had it, we sort of had it in our mind though in 2016. Pete Weiner and I, whom you mentioned earlier, talked a lot about this. Once you unleash this, it's not so easy to put the toothpaste back in the tube, to use that metaphor, and people get used to it. And once it semi-succeeds, and Trump holds the Senate even in 2018, despite losing the House, and Trump gets to change the whole character of the Supreme Court, and Trump gets to, Trumpists win in Republican primaries. Some of them lose because they're too extreme, but a lot of them make it to the House and to the Senate, as we've seen. And it's not, and then it has a momentum of its own. And the rhetoric has a momentum of its own, and the people end up liking kind of, scorning democracy, and that was always a danger. That was the danger. Once you unleash once you put a demagogue who's really divisive, demagogic, and willing to exploit people's grievances and prejudices in the presidency, not just the governor of one state, not George Wallace, not Joe McCarthy, a senator, but in the presidency for 4 years, and he doesn't change the way he campaigned, he just almost accelerates, you are really in for trouble. And then once the party is so complicit and so cowardly, whatever, that goes along and then stays going along after January 6th, it just gets deeper and deeper. And that's not to be despairing about it, but that is a real problem for the country.
I know we want to get to questions, but it's important to note, it's not only electoral. I mean, it's the routinization of political violence and threats, and at every level of public health officials, school board officials, election officials. We are living in a different country than we were before Trump came down the escalator. And as you say, it's really hard to see exactly how we go back anytime soon. Now, there is, I will say real quick, there is the more optimistic scenario that says that we are at the moment of maximum national freakout over demographic and cultural change. And in 10 years, as we're living through it, and as we go through these transitions, and people find out that the America they know is not going to be taken away from them forever, as Trump says, maybe it all comes down a bit, and I can be hopeful about that. But in the meantime, we've got some pretty rough seas ahead.
Yeah, no, I did a conversation with the veteran Democratic strategist Doug Sosnick, whom you know well, and who's a very smart and thoughtful guy. And that's sort of his view. Very worrisome and risky few years. And look, you never get to the long term if the short term is bad enough. But maybe work like 60s, 70s, chaotic, difficult, violent, real tensions, people. But then you kind of make it through, and the demography takes hold, millennials and Gen Z, and and the more diverse electorate, and people kind of realize that some of the demagoguery was just nuts. And I don't know. That would be I guess that is sort of a hopeful view, right? Still requires some leadership to get there, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, by the way, I would say about the 70s, not only a lot of chaos, but great movies and TV, as described in Walking on the Water. So,
are we getting?
It does take leadership, and and in a way, the argument of Biden's age that I'm most receptive to, because I think he has been an effective president. Like, he's been a better president. I've covered him since the 80s. He's been a better president than I thought he would be, given the way he operated in the Senate. But the opportunity cost is he doesn't really have the ability to mobilize or engage the country and to use the bully pulpit to shape the national dialogue in any meaningful way, except maybe he had some effect, in kind of stamping the Republicans as MAGA extremists, but like leading us through this transition. I mean, someone who's dynamic and in their 40s or early 50s, who is living this transition and can help Americans understand why we have more to gain than to fear from the society we're becoming. I personally really feel the absence of that hole there, kind of Obama again, or someone like that, who could kind of, and not that, it's not the Green Lantern theory that like any president can, solve all these problems through force of will, but Biden's ability to explain to the country in a persuasive way what it's going through was limited, is limited even if he was a younger Biden, because of who he is. And as an older Biden, it's just not there very much at all.
And I do think, and this is one of the couple of the questions, is why is the Biden administration bad at telling its story and stuff? They don't seem to even quite think, to be fair. I mean, that's part of what they should be doing. They have plenty of, they have some good young cabinet members. They could say to a couple of them, the presidents can start commissions. Many presidents have a commission on the future of this and that, and let's have younger leaders, who some of them are Republicans, some bipartisan stuff. Even the New World, where I think he's done a pretty good job in foreign policy and been a little clear on some of that. But even there, huge opportunity. Mitt Romney saying he's not going to run again. Why, make Romney special envoy on Ukraine, and let's have a new quote. You might post-Cold War, kind of Cold War like, bipartisan consensus. They don't really quite. I don't know. Do you think they don't quite think that way, and is that a problem? I do feel like, I mean, Buttigieg, Raimondo, they have some impressive young people, and also Vice President Harris herself. I mean, they just haven't used any of these people really. They
have some interlocking theories of the case. I mean, the inner circle around Biden is small. It's all people I've known since the 80s, really, and they are people very much shaped by the Clinton era in politics, when much more of the electorate was composed of non-college whites, and Democrats had to tread really carefully to get permission from those voters to be entrusted with power, and they are very much shaped by that. And I think the theory of those around Biden is that the last few points he needs are from voters who are intrinsically dubious of what a Democrat wants to do, and that you have to basically reassure them. And, Biden thinks there is tremendous value, and the people around him, in the contrast with the chaos of Trump, the chaos of Trump, not so much Trump as a threat to democracy, just the sheer chaos of it. And normality and calmness helps you get those last few points. And, he is also, as I said, kind of a pre-60s Democrat. He's kind of a Scoop Jackson, Warren Magnuson, Hubert Humphrey Democrat. He wants to fight out the election on the grounds of who can deliver for working families, as opposed to like big, sweeping declarations or confrontations over values. I think that's a mistake. I don't think, I shouldn't say that. I don't think he can win that argument in the end. I do not think on election day, especially if it's against Trump, that a majority of voters will go into the ballot box thinking that Biden has been better for my bottom line than Trump was. I don't see that as a reasonable possibility, given the persistence of inflation and the degree to which people feel they've been injured by it. I think the majority for Biden actually is that even if there isn't a majority who believe he has delivered for their interests, there is a majority who believe Trump is an offense or an affront to their values. But having said that, narrowing that gap, all of their effort, right, Bill, his effort is overwhelmingly toward convincing. He doesn't focus on convincing college-educated, upper middle-class suburbanites that Trump is a threat to their values. He's focused, and his advertising is focused, and it'll be all the way through on convincing blue-collar people that he has actually delivered for them economically. Like I said, I don't think he can get to a majority on that, but if he gets that up 3 points, that might be what allows him to win. So that's their theory. So like their theory does not allow him to do what many in the audience would want him to do, although I think he will eventually get back, and he has to, because the other thing doesn't, he will get back to Trump is this MAGA threat to your rights and your values, because I don't think he can win an argument on the economy with Trump.
I mean, I talked with a Democrat today who pretty much, articulated a version of what you're saying, which is what their theory is, but then his view, and he kind of agrees with that theory to some fair amount.
Yeah.
Also said, are they executing that very well? I mean, infrastructure, I'll tell you one quick story, that I want to get to another question about the Hill. If a young guy in our office said the other day, maybe we should do some ads on infrastructure. It doesn't seem to be getting any attention, and we could have Republicans in some of these districts. A Republican in Philadelphia and Pennsylvania could say, you know what, I-95 collapsed and Biden and Shapiro got it going again. My livelihood depends on that. I'm a truck driver, whatever, and I'm a Republican, but I got to say, I give Biden credit for doing that. He was a good, and that was the money that he spent and made sure it happened. And Buttigieg showed up and, helped make sure that whatever, right? I mean, but I was so struck, this young guy in our office. So I said, they are trying to make that message out. In fact, the Democratic Party and the associated groups can kind of swamp our spending on this. And they think they're making their infrastructure case. And Mitch Landrieu, who's a capable politician, White House allegedly leading this effort. And Buttigieg is probably the most, visible secretary. But I do feel they somehow don't quite have a feel for how in 2023 to have a message break through. Or maybe
there's certainly
hear about the media. So talk a minute about that.
Their television advertising is certainly focused on these themes. I mean, their television advertising that they started very early is a combination of Biden's investment agenda is creating good paying jobs that don't require a college degree. Like the signature ad is a woman spreading concrete, and talking about how she has more money to support her family. And they will tout the portions of their agenda that they say are helping families deal with costs, lowering utility costs and lowering drug costs through Medicare negotiation. And those are real. And he will spend in the relevant states, I'm guessing $600 million in ads on those themes. Like, not he'll spend more than in ads, but he'll spend, but there are Democrats who believe that so long as the basic necessities of life cost more for people in November 24 than they did in November 2020, which is highly likely, there's only so far you can get with that positive message. Again, like, they may be right, that is the right place for them to focus their efforts, because improving even a little will, but what matters. But I personally would not be shocked if Biden does not run as well among non-college voters in 24 as he did in 20, even among non-college voters who are not white as he did in 20. And he will have to win by running a little better among college-educated voters who are not as squeezed by inflation, who are more likely to say that Trump is a threat to democracy and more likely to prioritize abortion rights. I think that's entirely doable. I think the Wisconsin election shows the path. The Wisconsin election that we talked about, the state Supreme Court election, the margins in Dane County, Madison, were unimaginable, astronomical. Turnout was pretty disappointing among Black voters in Milwaukee, who are feeling squeezed economically, and probably, even if they agree on abortion, it doesn't energize them as much. And I kind of think that I'm going to see a lot of that around the country. I'm going to see that in Philadelphia versus suburbs. I'm going to see that in Detroit versus suburbs, maybe Phoenix versus suburbs. It's going to be hard, with inflation being what it is, for Biden to match his 2020 showing among working class voters who are feeling squeezed. But I think it's entirely possible, given inflation, given abortion in January 6th, that he could exceed his 2020 showing in the white collar suburbs.
It becomes very important then to have some mechanism to push up Black turnout, or keep it up at least. Well, it hasn't been great in the Biden years. And youth turnout, and I think there the age issue does hit. And this is where this Democrat I had lunch with today was saying, I just can't believe that they haven't begun the youth effort really yet. They haven't begun a huge campaign, that they think it could all be done in the last 6 months, but I don't know. And maybe they can be. And look, these guys know what they're doing, presumably, but he was a little alarmed, less on the conceptual side and less on the Carville, these tools, and more on the just, is the execution there? It's a small group of people, as you say. 2020 was a weird election with a pandemic. So, well, we'll see. Let me ask you about the Hill quickly, about just 4 minutes.
Yeah.
I mean,
I'll be fast.
Like, the world is so much going on, and such a momentous time that the Speaker of the House announced an impeachment inquiry into the President of the United States yesterday, I guess. And we haven't even gotten to it yet. It's like it probably deserves. What is it real? Is it going to amount to anything? Could it backfire on the Republicans?
I think it could backfire on the Republicans. Look, go back real quick. 2022, 80% of voters described the economy in negative terms. 55% of the exit polls said they disapproved of Biden's performance. Democrats overperformed precisely because an unusually large percentage of voters who are down on the economy and down on the incumbent president voted for them anyway because they viewed the alternative as too extreme. That could easily happen again, particularly in the 18 districts that voted, Republican-held districts that voted for Biden. There's another dozen or so that only narrowly voted for Trump. Sooner or later, McCarthy announced this unilaterally because he doesn't have the votes to approve a resolution of an impeachment inquiry on the floor. And that is that's a ceiling. Sooner or later, for this to go anywhere, he's going to have a vote. I mean, yes, Pelosi started an impeachment inquiry in 2019 on Ukraine, but there was a vote not long thereafter. And of course, there had to be a vote on impeachment itself. So sooner or later, he's going to have to get a majority of the House to vote to do something on this. And right now, he has no evidence that would allow him, I think, to move those who are resistant. Maybe he can terrify them with Trump-led Republican primaries, but I think he is operating from a place of, this is more about Kevin McCarthy's job security than Biden's job security, is what I said on TV last night.
I mean, it does suggest, and I'll just close on this, that the Republican extremism theme, which did hurt them in 2022, though they still won the national popular vote in the House, but that was an off-year election, a little different from presidential, right? I mean, maybe the Republican extremism, if it manifests itself in a sort of, abortive or, confusing and chaotic impeachment inquiry, if it manifests itself in sort of splits within the Republican Party on aid to Ukraine, a government shutdown, Trump being the nominee, maybe Biden's, maybe in a way they're right to think just the chaos.
That's their theory. That's their theory.
You don't have to go through all this deep analysis about the 1850s, and the chaos kind of just puts off enough people, and that Biden's been a pretty good president, and they do need the economy to keep improving, inflation to keep going down, and that to register with voters. And I hear him a little bit scarred by being in the George H.W. Bush White House. And I think in 1992, we had 3.5% economic growth, came out of the recession very nicely. Budget deficit started to come down. And everyone thought economy's horrible because it was bad in late 91, right?
Can I do one second? The problem for Biden is that even if inflation slows down, it doesn't mean prices are going down. Right. Things are still more expensive than when he took office. And that will likely be the case in November 2024, which is why I am persuaded by the arguments of those Democrats who believe that he is unlikely to get too much credit for the good things he's done on the economy. So long as that is true, he can get more than he's getting now. He can narrow that gap, but ultimately, I think he has to win this election on values and rights.
That's appropriate, and values matter a lot. Thank you, Ron Brownstein, and thank you all. And
good night, everybody.
Thanks.